Patricia Hartwell's hands trembled over a dead screen. $80 million dissolving into darkness. Her entire IT team frozen. Derek Lawson, the director of technology, stammering excuses no one believed. Somewhere in the corner, a mop clattered against the floor. Ray Callahan stepped forward in his faded janitor uniform, calluses on his palms, still damp from scrubbing toilets an hour ago. Security moved to block him, but when his fingers touched the keyboard, something shifted in the room. Derek's face went pale, the kind of look a man wears when his past walks back through the door. What happened next would not only save an empire, it would expose a truth buried for 5 years. The fluorescent lights on the 40th floor of Hartwell Industries hummed their cold, indifferent tune. It was 11 minutes past midnight, and Ray Callahan pushed his mop bucket down the marble corridor, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished stone. His reflection moved alongside him in the floor-to-ceiling windows, a ghostly figure in faded blue coveralls, the word maintenance stitched across his back in threads that had begun to unravel. Beyond the glass, the city sparkled like a circuit board, millions of lights blinking in patterns he once understood better than anyone. Now those patterns meant nothing more than another night of work, another shift spent invisible among the powerful. Ray paused outside the executive conference room, his eyes catching the sleek laptops and leather chairs arranged around a table that probably cost more than his annual salary. 5 years ago, he would have belonged in a room like this. 5 years ago, his fingers danced across keyboards, solving problems that made grown men weep with frustration. 5 years ago, Carolyn was alive, and the future stretched before them like an open highway. He squeezed the mop handle until his knuckles whitened, then forced himself to keep moving. The past was a country he could no longer afford to visit. His daughter Penny was 7 now, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's stubborn chin. She would be asleep at Mrs. Carter's apartment 3 blocks away, probably clutching that threadbare rabbit she refused to abandon. Ray worked the night shift specifically so he could be there when she woke up, could make her breakfast, walk her to school, help with homework before exhaustion finally claimed him for a few hours of dreamless sleep. It wasn't much of a life, but it was theirs. He had learned to find dignity in the smallest victories, in the moments when Penny laughed at his terrible jokes or fell asleep against his shoulder during their Saturday morning cartoons. The notebook in his back pocket pressed against him as he worked, a constant reminder of the man he used to be. During his 15-minute breaks, while other janitors smoked or scrolled through their phones, Ray studied. Python updates, cloud architecture changes, new security protocols. He devoured technical articles like a starving man at a feast, telling himself it was just a hobby, knowing deep down it was hope refusing to die. The skills that had once made him valuable were still there, buried beneath 5 years of grief and survival, waiting for a chance that would probably never come. He remembered the day everything fell apart with surgical precision. Carolyn's funeral had been on a Tuesday, gray sky, weeping rain that matched his hollow chest. He had taken 2 weeks of bereavement leave from Nexus Tech, 2 weeks to figure out how to explain death to a 2-year-old, 2 weeks to learn that grief doesn't follow corporate timelines. When he returned, security had escorted him to HR instead of his desk. A catastrophic server failure had occurred during his absence, and somehow all the evidence pointed to his credentials, his access codes, his supposed negligence. Derek Lawson, the colleague he had mentored and trusted, stood in the corner of that HR office with an expression Ray would never forget. Not guilt, not shame, triumph. The industry blacklisted him within months. Every application met with the same response: concerns about his record, regrets about the circumstances, doors closing so fast he could feel the wind. He sold their house, then the car, then most of their furniture. Eventually, he found this job, nights spent cleaning the offices of people who would never know his name. and he told himself it was enough. Penny had a roof and food, and a father who would never abandon her. That had to be enough. He finished mopping the executive corridor and checked his watch. 6 more hours until dawn, until he could hold his daughter again and pretend the world made sense. Tonight felt different from the moment Ray stepped off the service elevator. The 40th floor crackled with an energy he hadn't sensed since his days in server rooms, that particular electricity that precedes disaster. Executives who normally left by 7 were still hunched over laptops, their expensive suits wrinkled, their hair disheveled from anxious fingers. Through the glass walls of the main conference room, he could see people gesturing frantically, phones pressed to ears, faces illuminated by the blue glow of screens displaying nothing but error messages. Something had gone terribly wrong. Ray kept his head down and pushed his cart toward the east wing, but fragments of panicked conversation drifted toward him like smoke. Henderson Corp., 80 million. Tomorrow morning. System down. He understood enough to piece together the crisis. Hartwell Industries was about to close the biggest deal in its history, a partnership that would be finalized in a matter of hours, and their entire infrastructure had collapsed. The irony wasn't lost on him. A technology company brought to its knees by its own technology. He had seen it happen before, had prevented it from happening more times than he could count, back when anyone cared what he thought. The elevator at the end of the hall chimed, and Patricia Hartwell herself stepped out. Ray had seen the CEO only in passing, a figure who existed in a different stratosphere, but tonight she looked almost human. Her designer blazer was missing a button. Her usually immaculate hair had escaped its pins, and her eyes carried the wild desperation of someone watching their legacy crumble. She strode past Ray without a glance, her heels striking the marble like gunshots, and disappeared into the conference room. Through the glass, he watched her slam her palms on the table, watched grown men flinch at her fury. Then Derek Lawson arrived, and Ray's blood turned to ice. The man hadn't changed much in 5 years. Same expensive haircut, same practiced confidence, same smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wore the title of IT director now, a position Ray had been groomed for before his world collapsed, and he walked into that conference room like he owned it. Ray watched through the glass as Derek spread his hands in a gesture of helpless authority, pointing at screens, shaking his head, already constructing the narrative of how this wasn't his fault. The same performance he had given 5 years ago. The same lies dressed in different clothes. Ray moved closer to the server room, ostensibly to empty a trash can, actually to get a better look at the monitors visible through the window. What he saw made his breath catch. The error patterns scrolling across those screens weren't random chaos. They were specific, almost surgical, the signature of a particular kind of system failure he had encountered exactly once before. At Nexus Tech. The night everything had been blamed on him, his hands began to tremble, not with fear, but with the terrible clarity of recognition. He knew what was wrong. More importantly, he knew how to fix it. The question was whether he was willing to step out of the shadows and risk everything he had left. He thought about Penny asleep at Mrs. Carter's, about the fragile stability they had built from the wreckage of their lives. If he stepped forward and failed, he would lose this job, the only income standing between his daughter and the street. If he stepped forward and succeeded, Derek would recognize him, would find some way to destroy him again. The smart choice was to walk away, to keep mopping floors and cashing paychecks and pretending the past didn't exist. But Ray had never been particularly smart about the things that mattered. He watched Patricia Hartwell's face crumble as another system alert flashed red, watched Derek shrug with theatrical helplessness, and made his decision. Some fires were too important not to fight, even if you got burned. 4 o'clock in the morning arrived like a verdict. The crisis had stretched into its 5th hour with no resolution in sight, and the 40th floor had taken on the atmosphere of a battlefield hospital. Coffee cups littered every surface, some still steaming, most long forgotten. Personnel sprawled in chairs with the exhausted posture of soldiers after a forced march, their ties loosened, their faith in their own expertise clearly shaken. Derek paced the server room like a caged animal, barking orders that no one believed would help, while Patricia sat motionless in her office, staring at the phone that would soon ring with Henderson Corp's cancellation. Ray had retreated to the maintenance closet, his sanctuary on nights like this, but he couldn't stop his mind from working the problem. The error patterns suggested a cascading failure triggered by a corrupted authentication protocol, something that would look random to anyone who didn't know what they were seeing. He had written a paper on this exact vulnerability during his second year at Nexus Tech, a paper Derek had dismissed as overly cautious. The solution required understanding how the corrupted packets were propagating through the system, isolating the source, and rebuilding the authentication chain from clean backups. It would take someone who truly understood the architecture, someone willing to work backwards from symptoms to cause. Howard Miller found him there, sitting on an overturned bucket with his notebook open, scribbling diagrams he told himself he wouldn't use. Howard had been a janitor at Hartwell for 20 years, a quiet man with observant eyes who never asked personal questions, but somehow always knew when something was wrong. He looked at Ray's notebook, at the technical shorthand that had nothing to do with cleaning supplies, and raised one gray eyebrow. "You understand that stuff?" Howard asked, gesturing toward the chaos visible through the cracked closet door. Ray considered lying, then remembered that Howard had once covered his shift without being asked when Penny had the flu. "I used to work in IT," Ray said, the words feeling strange after years of silence. "Before, a different life." Howard nodded slowly, the way he did when processing information others might dismiss. "That man out there, the one in charge of fixing things, he seems more interested in explaining why it can't be fixed." Ray said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Howard sat down on another bucket, his knees creaking in protest, and studied Ray with the patience of someone who had learned that important things took time. "I've watched you for 3 years," Howard continued. "You're different from the others. You look at the computers like they're old friends. You carry that notebook like other men carry pictures of their families." Ray closed the notebook, embarrassed by how much it revealed. "It doesn't matter what I know. That world isn't mine anymore." Howard made a sound that might have been disagreement. A man running from his past is still defined by it. The only difference is which direction he's facing. He stood, joints popping, and moved toward the door. "The woman up there is about to lose everything her father built. The man who could help her is hiding in a closet, protecting something that died 5 years ago." He paused at the threshold, not looking back. Fear is a reasonable choice, but so is courage. At least courage doesn't leave you wondering what might have been. Ray sat alone in the closet for another 10 minutes, his notebook pressed against his chest like a shield. Howard's words echoed in the small space, mixing with older voices. Carolyn on their wedding day, promising to love the man he was becoming. Penny last Tuesday, asking why Daddy looked sad when he thought she wasn't watching. His own voice, the one he heard in nightmares, begging HR to investigate Derek's claims instead of simply accepting them. He had spent 5 years being afraid. Afraid of failure, afraid of hope, afraid of becoming visible again in a world that had already rejected him once. But fear had given him nothing except smaller and smaller spaces to hide in, until even a maintenance closet felt like too much exposure. He found himself walking toward the server room before he consciously decided to move. His feet knew the path, even if his mind still argued against it. Through the glass, he could see Derek leaning over a technician's shoulder, pointing at code he clearly didn't understand, performing competence for an audience that had stopped believing. Patricia stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression the carefully blank mask of someone preparing for catastrophic loss. The security guard stationed outside the door looked at Ray's janitor uniform and stepped forward to block his path. "Authorized personnel only," the guard said, not unkindly but firmly. "I can fix it." The words came out rough, like something long, buried, finally breaking through concrete. The guard's expression shifted from professional neutrality to poorly concealed pity. Another crazy janitor thinking he could solve problems that stumped entire teams. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back." Ray didn't move. He couldn't. Forward was the only direction left that made sense. "I know what's wrong with your system. I know because I've seen this exact failure before, and I know how to fix it." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, muscle memory from 1,000 technical presentations returning despite the years. "The authentication protocol has been corrupted at the root level. Your team is trying to treat the symptoms while the disease keeps spreading." The guard reached for his radio, ready to call for backup to remove the delusional maintenance man, when Patricia Hartwell's voice cut through the tension. "Wait." She had turned toward the commotion, and something in Ray's certainty had caught her attention. Ray met her eyes for the first time, saw the exhaustion there, the desperation barely contained behind professional composure. "You said you've seen this before. Where?" Before Ray could answer, Derek pushed past the technicians to see what was happening. Recognition crashed across his face like a wave hitting shore, followed immediately by something darker. Fear. "Patricia, this is ridiculous. He's a janitor. He doesn't know anything about our systems." "Then let him prove it," Patricia said, her voice carrying the steel that had built her empire. "We have less than 4 hours before Henderson Corp's representatives arrive, and your team has accomplished nothing. If the cleaning staff has a better idea, I'm willing to listen." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Ray watched him calculate, watched the panic flicker behind his eyes, and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but sadness. 5 years ago, he had considered this man a friend. 15 minutes, Ray said, directing his words to Patricia, while keeping Derek in his peripheral vision. "Give me 15 minutes at the console. If I can't isolate the problem by then, I'll leave, and you'll never see me again." Patricia studied him with the same analytical intensity she probably brought to billion-dollar negotiations. Ray stood still and let her look, let her see the calluses on his hands, and the stains on his uniform, and whatever else she needed to make her decision. He had nothing to prove to her except results, and results would speak louder than any explanation of his past. 15 minutes, she finally said. "Jenkins, let him through." The guard stepped aside with obvious reluctance. Derek made one more attempt to intervene, something about liability and protocols, but Patricia silenced him with a look that could have frozen the sun. Ray walked into the server room on legs that felt simultaneously like concrete and air. The console felt like coming home to a house he thought had burned down. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly, before muscle memory took over and he began to work. Around him, the IT team watched with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. Derek positioned himself where Ray couldn't ignore him, arms crossed, radiating contempt. None of it mattered. The code on the screen spoke a language Ray had never forgotten, and it was telling him exactly what he needed to know. The corruption was worse than he had initially thought, deeper in the system than a surface scan would reveal. But the architecture held enough integrity for recovery if he moved quickly and precisely. 10 minutes passed, like 10 seconds. Ray's awareness narrowed to the screen, the keyboard, the elegant logic of systems behaving badly. He traced the corruption to its source, a vulnerability in the authentication handshake that had been exploited either through negligence or intention. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for, and Ray had spent months studying this exact pattern after Nexus Tech blamed him for creating it. His fingers flew across the keys, isolating compromised sectors, rebuilding verification chains, speaking commands to the machine that responded with increasing stability. The red warning lights began to flicker orange, then yellow. At 13 minutes, the main display shifted from chaos to order. Systems that had been throwing errors for hours suddenly reported clean status. The authentication chain rebuilt itself from the restored foundation, each server coming back online like lights turning on in a dark house. Ray entered the final sequence of commands, held his breath, and watched the master status indicator shift from critical to stable. Green lights cascaded across the monitoring systems. Behind him, someone whispered a profanity of pure amazement. Patricia Hartwell stepped forward, her reflection appearing beside Ray's in the darkened monitor, her expression a complex mixture of relief and calculation. "Who the hell are you?" Ray turned from the console to face a room transformed by shock. The IT team sat frozen in their chairs, their professional pride clearly struggling against the evidence of their own inadequacy. Patricia Hartwell stood close enough for Ray to see the questions racing behind her eyes, the sharp intelligence already working to understand how a janitor had done in 15 minutes what her entire technology department had failed to accomplish in 5 hours. And Derek Lawson lurked near the back of the room, his face a battlefield where surprise was losing ground to something uglier. Survival instinct, the cornered animal calculation of a man seeing his carefully constructed world, threatened by ghosts he thought he had buried. "My name is Ray Callahan," Ray said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "I've worked maintenance here for 3 years. Before that, I was a senior systems engineer at Nexus Tech." He watched Derek flinch at the company name, watched the blood drain from his face as the implications became clear. Patricia's eyes narrowed, data points connecting in her formidable mind. Nexus Tech. They had a major security breach about 5 years ago, lost several major clients before they recovered. She paused, her gaze shifting to Derek with new suspicion. "Around the time you joined our company, Derek." Derek stepped forward, his composure cracking, but not yet shattered. "Patricia, I can explain. This man was fired from Nexus Tech for gross negligence. He caused the very disaster he's pretending to have solved tonight. You can't possibly trust him over your own IT director." The lies came smooth and practiced, polished by 5 years of repetition. But Ray noticed something Derek apparently didn't. Patricia's expression hadn't softened. If anything, her scrutiny had intensified, focused now not on Ray but on the man desperately trying to discredit him. "I didn't ask for his employment history, Derek. I asked for his name. Why does his presence seem to concern you so much?" Ray could have spoken then, could have launched into the defense he had rehearsed 1,000 times in the years after Nexus Tech destroyed his career. Instead, he remained silent. The truth had its own momentum now, and Patricia Hartwell hadn't become a billionaire by accepting the first explanation offered to her. She turned to one of her assistants, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Get me everything we have on Derek Lawson's background check. Every reference, every former employer, every professional recommendation. And pull the incident reports from our systems over the past 18 months. I want them on my desk in 20 minutes. Derek's mask finally cracked. "This is absurd. I've given 5 years to this company. You're going to believe a janitor over me based on nothing but coincidence?" His voice had risen, stripped of its usual polished control, revealing the panic beneath. Ray watched him and felt something unexpected. Not triumph, but a strange kind of pity. Derek had built his entire career on a foundation of betrayal, and foundations like that always crumbled eventually. The only question was how much damage they caused when they fell. Patricia ignored Derek's outburst completely, her attention fixed on Ray with uncomfortable intensity. "Mr. Callahan," she said, the formality somehow making the moment more significant. "I'm offering you a position as senior IT engineer, effective immediately. Your salary will be commensurate with your demonstrated skills, plus a signing bonus for your work tonight. We'll discuss specifics once the Henderson deal is finalized." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown across a vast distance. Ray thought about Penny, about the apartment they could finally afford to heat properly, about the future that had seemed permanently foreclosed, suddenly opening like a door he thought was locked forever. He also thought about Derek still in the building, still desperate, still dangerous. "I appreciate the offer," Ray said carefully, "but I have a condition. Before I accept any position, I want access to your complete system logs for the past 2 years. Not just tonight's incident. Everything." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded without hesitation. "You think tonight's failure wasn't accidental?" It wasn't a question. Ray glanced at Derek, who had gone pale enough to match the white walls. "I think patterns repeat themselves, Miss Hartwell. And I think someone who sabotages one employer is likely to sabotage another." Derek made a sound that might have been protest, might have been the beginning of a confession choked off by self-preservation. Patricia was already moving, pulling out her phone, issuing commands with the efficiency of someone who understood that moments of crisis were also moments of opportunity. "Jenkins, escort Mr. Lawson to conference room B. He's not to leave or communicate with anyone until I say otherwise." Derek's protests echoed down the hallway as security led him away, increasingly frantic claims of innocence that convinced no one. Ray watched him go and felt the weight of 5 years begin to lift from his shoulders. Not completely. Some burdens became part of you, woven into your bones, but enough to breathe properly for the first time since Carolyn's funeral. The next several hours passed in a blur of investigation and revelation. Ray sat at the console that had been Derek's domain, pulling logs and analyzing patterns, while Patricia's legal team assembled in an adjacent conference room. What he found exceeded even his suspicions. Derek hadn't just failed to prevent security breaches. He had created them, carefully constructed vulnerabilities that allowed him to sell company data to competitors while maintaining plausible deniability. 18 months of betrayal documented in server logs, transaction records, and encrypted communications that Derek had apparently believed were untraceable. Ray traced each thread with methodical precision, building a case that no amount of charm or deflection could dismantle. Patricia observed most of his work, asking occasional questions that revealed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of technology for someone who ran a company rather than programming its systems. When Ray finally compiled his findings into a comprehensive report, she read through it twice before speaking. "This is enough for criminal prosecution," she said quietly. "Corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, possibly fraud. He'll go to prison." Ray nodded, remembering Derek's face 5 years ago, the triumph that had burned behind his eyes as he watched Ray's career disintegrate. "He did the same thing at Nexus Tech, blamed me for his own sabotage. My wife had just died, and I was too broken to fight back." The confrontation happened in the conference room where Derek had been waiting, surrounded by lawyers and security personnel, his earlier arrogance completely dissolved. He tried denial first, then bargaining, then something approaching honesty when he realized neither would save him. "You don't understand the pressure," he said, not to anyone in particular, his voice hollow. "The expectations, the competition. I wasn't as smart as people thought I was. I just knew how to make it look like I was." He finally met Ray's eyes, 5 years of guilt and resentment surfacing in his expression. "You were going to expose me eventually. At Nexus Tech. You were too good not to figure it out. I just acted first." Ray stood by the window, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and pink, and listened to the confession of the man who had destroyed his life. He waited for satisfaction to arrive, for the vindication to feel as sweet as he had imagined during countless nights, pushing a mop down empty corridors. Instead, he felt only a vast, weary sadness. All those years lost, all those struggles endured, because one man couldn't admit his own limitations. "I have a daughter," Ray finally said, his voice quiet but carrying across the room. "When you blamed me, when you made sure no one in the industry would hire me, you didn't just hurt me. You hurt a 2-year-old girl who had already lost her mother." Derek had no response to that. Some sins were too large for words. Security escorted Derek out of the building shortly after dawn, his wrists in handcuffs, his career in ruins, his freedom soon to follow. Ray watched from the 40th floor window until the police car disappeared into morning traffic, then turned to find Patricia standing beside him. "The Henderson representatives will be here in an hour," she said. "Thanks to you, we still have a deal to close." She paused, something softening in her usually sharp expression. "I've been running this company since my father died, and I've learned to read people. You could have stayed hidden tonight. You could have let us fail and kept your safe, small life. Why didn't you?" Ray considered the question, knowing the simple answers wouldn't suffice, and the complicated ones would take more time than they had. "My daughter asked me once why I always looked sad when I thought she wasn't watching," he said slowly. "I didn't have an answer for her then. I think I do now." He turned from the window to meet Patricia's eyes. "I was sad because I had stopped believing I could be the person she deserved. Tonight, I remembered that the person she deserves isn't the one who hides from the past. It's the one who faces it." Patricia nodded slowly, and something passed between them that neither of them named. "Then let's make sure she knows that person," she said. "Starting with your new office." 3 weeks after the longest night of his life, Ray Callahan walked into Hartwell Industries through the front entrance for the first time. The security guard who had once blocked his path to the server room now nodded respectfully, and the receptionist smiled with recognition rather than confusion. His new badge identified him as Director of Information Technology, the same position Derek had held, though Ray planned to fill it very differently. The corner office on the 40th floor still felt surreal, with its leather furniture and panoramic views, but he had added a single personal touch, a framed photo of Penny on his desk, positioned so she would be the first thing he saw each morning. Penny had handled the changes with the remarkable adaptability of children, though she still seemed confused about why Daddy suddenly wore suits instead of coveralls. The morning of his first official day, she had studied his reflection in the mirror with scholarly intensity before pronouncing her verdict. "You look different, but your eyes are the same." Ray had knelt down to her level, something he'd always done when he needed her to understand something important, and explained that Daddy had a new job, a job more like the one he'd had before she was born. "Does that mean you won't be tired all the time?" she had asked. "Does that mean we can go to the park on Saturdays?" Those questions had meant more than any salary or title ever could. Howard Miller came to visit on Ray's second day, appearing in the doorway of the corner office with his characteristic quiet dignity. He had announced his retirement the week before, claiming his joints were too old for another winter of mopping floors, though Ray suspected he had simply been waiting for the right moment to leave. "Looks like you found your way out of the closet," Howard said, settling into one of the guest chairs with a satisfied expression. Ray laughed, the sound still unfamiliar after years of suppressing it. "Couldn't have done it without you, if you hadn't pushed me that night." Howard waved away the gratitude with a weathered hand. "You were always going to find your way back," Howard said with quiet certainty. "Some men are meant for brooms, and that's honest work, nothing wrong with it. But you were just passing through, waiting for the right moment to remember who you really are." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, placing it on Ray's desk. The old notebook, worn soft with use, its pages filled with technical diagrams and desperate hope. "You left this in the closet that night. Thought you might want it back." Ray picked up the notebook, feeling its familiar weight, remembering all the nights he had filled its pages while the world slept. "I think I'll keep it," he said. "To remember where I've been." The calls from his former colleagues at Nexus Tech started arriving the week after Derek's arrest made industry news. Apologies wrapped in embarrassment, explanations hedged with qualifications, offers of reconciliation that came 5 years too late. Ray accepted their words with grace, but no promises. The past was a country he had finally stopped running from, but that didn't mean he owed it anything. His focus now was forward. Rebuilding Hartwell's IT infrastructure with integrity Derek had never provided, creating opportunities for talented people overlooked by conventional hiring practices, proving that character mattered more than credentials. Patricia proved to be everything he had imagined a good leader would be, and several things he hadn't expected at all. She ran their weekly strategy meetings with crisp efficiency, but always made time for questions about Penny's school projects or soccer games. She had sent flowers to Carolyn's grave on the anniversary of her death, with a card that simply read, "She would be proud." Ray had stood at that gravestone for an hour, telling Carolyn about everything that had changed, and for the first time in 5 years, the words didn't taste like ashes. They tasted like the beginning of something new. The Henderson Deal celebration took place 3 months after the night that changed everything, in the grand ballroom of the Hartwell Industries headquarters. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across 200 guests in evening wear, their laughter and conversation creating a symphony of success. Ray stood near the windows in his first tailored suit, still slightly uncomfortable with formal events, but learning to adapt. Penny sat at a nearby table, wearing the new dress she had picked out herself, her eyes wide with wonder at the world her father now inhabited. She had asked approximately 1,000 questions during the drive over, each one a reminder of how much had changed since those midnight janitor shifts. Patricia found him there, 2 glasses of champagne in her hands, her usual business attire replaced by an elegant blue gown that matched her eyes. "You're hiding," she observed, offering him one of the glasses. "Not hiding," Ray corrected, accepting the drink. "Observing. Trying to figure out how I ended up here." Patricia moved to stand beside him, close enough that her perfume mingled with the champagne's fizz. "You ended up here because you're brilliant and brave, and you refuse to let one man's jealousy define your future." She paused, her voice softening. "Those are qualities worth celebrating." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the party swirl around them. 2 people who had found unexpected connection in the aftermath of crisis. Ray thought about the journey that had brought him here, the years of grief and struggle, the night when everything could have gone differently if he had simply kept mopping floors and minding his own business. He didn't regret those years anymore. They had taught him things success never could: patience, humility, the fierce love of a child who didn't care whether her father wore coveralls or custom suits. Those lessons were worth more than any corner office. Penny appeared at his elbow, her face smeared with chocolate from the dessert table, her eyes already beginning to droop with sleepiness. "Daddy," she said, tugging his hand, "can we go home soon?" Patricia knelt down to Penny's level, the same way Ray always did, and gently wiped the chocolate from her cheek with a napkin. "Did you save any dessert for me, Miss Penny?" Penny giggled, her tiredness temporarily forgotten. "There's lots more cake. Come see." She grabbed Patricia's hand and began pulling her toward the dessert table, chattering about the relative merits of chocolate versus vanilla. Ray watched them go, his daughter and the billionaire CEO, and felt something shift in his chest that had been frozen for 5 years. Patricia glanced back at him, her smile carrying questions she hadn't yet asked, and answers he was beginning to hope she wanted. The party continued around them, celebrating deals closed and futures secured, but Ray's attention remained fixed on the 2 figures at the dessert table. Penny was showing Patricia her favorite cake, gesturing with the earnest enthusiasm of a 7-year-old expert, and Patricia was listening with the focused intensity she usually reserved for board meetings. Later, much later, after the party had wound down and most guests had departed, Patricia insisted on driving Ray and Penny home. Penny fell asleep in the back seat before they reached the first traffic light, her head pillowed on her stuffed rabbit, her breathing soft and even. Patricia pulled up to their apartment building, a modest structure that now felt less like a compromise and more like a foundation, and turned off the engine. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling, until Penny stirred in the back seat. "Daddy," she murmured, still half asleep. "Can Miss Patricia come to our house sometime?" "She's nice." Patricia met Ray's eyes across the dim interior of the car, and he saw something there he hadn't expected from a woman who controlled empires. Vulnerability. Hope. The same careful wondering he felt stirring in his own chest, tentative as a plant, pushing through concrete. "I think," Ray said slowly, choosing his words with care he usually reserved for code, "that Miss Patricia is welcome anytime she wants to visit, if she wants to." Patricia's smile bloomed like sunrise over the city she ruled. "I want to," she said simply. "Very much." Penny made a satisfied sound and burrowed deeper into her rabbit, somehow sensing even in sleep that something important had been decided. Ray carried his daughter up to their apartment, Patricia walking beside him in her evening gown, like something from a fairy tale he had stopped believing in. At the door, they paused, the moment stretching with possibility. "Thank you," Ray said, and the words meant more than he could express. "For tonight, for the job, for believing I was more than a man with a mop." Patricia reached up and straightened his tie, her fingers lingering on his chest. "Thank you for being more," she replied. "Thank you for reminding me that the best people aren't always in the places we expect to find them." She kissed his cheek, a gentle promise of conversations to come, then walked back toward her car. Ray stood in the doorway, watching until her tail lights disappeared around the corner, Penny warm and heavy in his arms, the future stretching before them like an open road. He thought about the man he had been 5 years ago, broken by grief and betrayal, convinced that the best parts of his life were behind him. That man had been wrong about almost everything. The best parts weren't behind him. They were just beginning, built on foundations of struggle and loss that had made him strong enough to recognize them when they arrived. He carried his daughter inside, tucked her into bed with her rabbit, and stood at her window, watching the city lights blink their patterns in the darkness. Some doors close to open others, and sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a mop and the courage to set it down.